When judgment falls beyond the wall, even winter learns to fear. He didn't come to claim a throne or bend the knee, he came to burn every crown built on blood. Kings call themselves gods, but gods bleed just like men. So, what happens when the realm of endless suffering meets the one thing hell itself couldn't kill? Maester Corwin had witnessed many strange things in his 40 years of service to the Night's Watch, cataloguing oddities and sending ravens south with reports no one read, but nothing had prepared him for the rupture that split the northern darkness like a blade through silk. It was not lightning, nor was it the aurora that sometimes danced across the frozen wastes. This was something else entirely, a wound in the fabric of the world itself, hemorrhaging a light that burned with colors that had no names in any tongue spoken by men. The tear hung suspended above the haunted forest, pulsing with rhythms that felt wrong, as if the universe itself had developed an arrhythmic heartbeat. Through his brass telescope, Corwin watched as the edges of the rift glowed with an energy that seemed to consume the very air around it, turning snowflakes to steam before they could fall within 100 yards of its boundary. The temperature at Castle Black rose 3 degrees in as many minutes, an impossibility in the depths of winter, and men emerged from their quarters in confusion, staring north toward a light that should not exist. Then something fell through the wound. It was not a graceful descent but a violent ejection, as if reality itself had vomited forth something it could not contain. The figure plummeted through the frozen air, trailing streamers of that impossible light, and struck the earth north of the wall with an impact that shook the ancient ice foundations. Corwin felt the tremor through the stones beneath his feet, heard the crack of permafrost shattering under forces that should have atomized anything made of flesh and bone. A plume of superheated steam rose from the impact site, visible even at this distance, and for a long moment the world held its breath. The rift above sealed itself with a sound like thunder played backwards, collapsing inward until nothing remained but the natural darkness of the long night and the distant glow of something burning in the forest. Corwin descended from the rookery tower as fast as his aging legs could carry him, his chain of office rattling against his chest. He found Lord Commander Harron in the common hall, already armored and shouting orders. The Rangers were assembling with the practiced efficiency of men who had drilled for exactly this kind of impossible emergency, though none of them could have articulated what that emergency might be. Beyond the wall, something had arrived. Something that burned hot enough to melt ice that had not known liquid form in 8,000 years. The expedition set out within the hour, 24 rangers on horses that stamped and snorted nervously, sensing wrongness in the wind. Corwin accompanied them despite his advanced years, carrying his journal and his instruments, driven by the compulsion that had defined his entire life, to observe, to record, to understand. They rode hard through the gate and north into the haunted forest, following the pillar of steam that rose like a beacon against the star-scattered sky. The woods were silent in a way that transcended mere quiet, as if every living thing for miles had fled or died. No wind moved through the bare branches, no snow fell. Even the cold seemed diminished, pushed back by an ambient heat that intensified with every mile they traveled. They found the crater 2 hours before dawn. The impact site was a perfect circle burned into the frozen earth, 60 feet across and 20 deep at its center. The trees for 100 yards in every direction had been stripped of bark and branches, reduced to blackened spikes pointing accusingly at the sky. The permafrost had liquefied and then refrozen in waves, creating concentric rings of glass-smooth ice that reflected the torchlight in fractured patterns. At the bottom of the crater, cooling but still radiating enough heat to keep the Rangers at a distance, lay a figure in armor that seemed to have been forged from nightmare and divine mandate in equal measure. Corwin made his way down the crater's slope, his boots finding purchase on the rippled ice, ignoring the shouted warnings from above. He had to see. He had to know. The figure lay motionless at the crater's heart, face down in a pool of flash-melted and refrozen water, and as Corwin approached, he began to catalogue details with the methodical precision that had served him through decades of scholarship. The armor was unlike anything he had ever seen, green and bronze and silver, its surface marked with symbols that hurt to look at directly, as if they existed in more dimensions than his eyes could properly process. The craftsmanship transcended anything the smiths of Westeros could achieve. This was not metal shaped by hammer and anvil, but something that had been grown or conjured, every plate flowing seamlessly into the next, forming a second skin that looked both ancient and impossibly advanced. The helmet was a masterwork of contained fury, its visor shaped like the snarl of some predatory beast, and even motionless, the figure radiated an aura of such profound violence that Corwin's hands trembled as he reached out to touch the shoulder plate. The metal was warm, almost feverish, and the moment his fingers made contact, the figure moved. It was not a gradual awakening, but an instantaneous transition from absolute stillness to explosive motion. One moment the armored warrior lay prone and unconscious. The next, he was on his feet with a weapon in his hands, a massive double-barreled construct of metal and malice that Corwin's mind struggled to categorize. Not a crossbow, though it shared some conceptual similarities. Not a siege weapon, though it radiated the promise of destruction on that scale. The twin barrels leveled at Corwin's chest, and behind the helmet's visor something glowed with a light that was cousin to the rift that had birthed this arrival. Corwin raised his hands slowly, keeping his movements small and non-threatening, and spoke in the calmest voice he could manage. "Peace. We mean you no harm." The weapon did not lower. For 5 heartbeats that felt like 5 hours, Corwin stared into those glowing eyes and saw something that made his scholarly detachment crumble like ash. This was not a man, or if it had been once, that humanity had been burned away and reforged into something else entirely. This was wrath given form and purpose, violence elevated to the level of divine principle, and in those eyes Corwin saw reflected an eternity of war that made the conflicts of Westeros seem like children's games played with wooden swords. Then the weapon lowered, just slightly, and the figure's head turned to survey the crater, the forest, the rangers assembled at the rim with their bows drawn and arrows nocked. Corwin saw the calculation happening behind that helmet, saw tactical assessments being made at speeds that would shame the greatest military minds of the Seven Kingdoms. The figure took in every angle, every position, every potential threat, and dismissed them all as insignificant in the time it took Corwin to draw a single shaking breath. When the figure spoke, his voice emerged from some mechanism in the helmet, deep and grinding, like the sound of tectonic plates settling after an earthquake. The language was nothing Corwin had ever heard. Harsh syllables that felt designed to convey maximum information with minimum sound, and yet somehow the meaning was clear. Not through words, but through pure intention, transmitted directly into Corwin's mind with a force that made his skull ache. Where? Not a question, but a demand. And Corwin answered without conscious thought. Beyond the wall. The north of Westeros. The haunted forest. Each phrase felt inadequate, failing to convey the full context of place and time, but the figure absorbed the information and processed it with that same inhuman speed. The helmet turned north, toward the deeper darkness beyond the forest's edge, and Corwin saw the warrior stiffen. The weapon came up again, not pointing at the rangers but at something in the distance that only he could perceive. Corwin followed that gaze and saw nothing but darkness and dead trees, but the figure saw something else entirely. His entire posture changed, shifting from cautious assessment to active threat response, and when he moved it was with a speed that should have been impossible for something wearing that much armor. He simply started walking north, each step purposeful and measured, ignoring the crater's slope as if gravity itself had decided to make an exception. The rangers scrambled to get out of his path as he ascended the crater wall with the same ease most men would climb stairs. Lord Commander Harren shouted something, probably a command to bar the stranger's way, but the words died in his throat as the armored figure passed within 10 feet of him. The sheer presence, the overwhelming sense of barely contained apocalypse, froze every man present. Corwin followed, compelled by something deeper than curiosity. The stranger moved through the forest with absolute confidence, never hesitating, never slowing, following some sense that had nothing to do with sight or sound. The rangers trailed behind at a distance, their horses refusing to get closer, and Corwin walked in the stranger's wake, feeling like a moth drawn to a flame that would immolate the entire world. They had traveled perhaps 2 miles when the temperature dropped. It was not a gradual cooling but a sudden plunge, as if they had crossed an invisible threshold into a different season entirely. The heat that had emanated from the crater vanished, replaced by a cold so profound it made the normal winter chill seem tropical by comparison. Frost formed on Corwin's beard in seconds. His breath emerged in clouds so thick they obscured his vision. The rangers behind him began shouting warnings, and when Corwin turned to look back he saw why. The trees at the forest's edge were moving. No, not moving, freezing. The bare branches were acquiring a coating of ice that grew visibly, spreading from trunk to tip in crystalline patterns that caught the starlight and threw it back in shattered rainbows. The frost advanced like a living thing, racing through the forest, and everything it touched transformed into sculpture. Birds frozen mid-flight fell from their roosts. Small animals caught in their burrows became statues of their final moments. The cold was not natural, could never be natural, and it was advancing toward them with predatory intent. The armored figure stopped and turned to face the oncoming freeze. He stood perfectly still as the temperature continued its impossible descent, as ice formed on his armor and then sublimated away from the heat still radiating from the metal beneath. Corwin huddled against a tree, wrapping his cloak tight, and watched as the forest ahead of them began to glow with a pale blue light. They came through the trees like nightmares made manifest. The White Walkers moved with an unnatural grace, their bodies composed of ice and ancient malice, their eyes burning with the same blue light that had started appearing in the dying and the dead for months now. There were dozens of them, perhaps hundreds, flowing through the forest in a silence that was somehow worse than any war cry. Behind them came the Whites, corpses animated by dark magic, shambling and lurching but no less deadly for their lack of coordination. The army of the dead had arrived, and between them and Castle Black stood one man in green armor and 24 rangers who suddenly understood how profoundly outmatched they were. Lord Commander Harron screamed the order to fall back, to ride hard for the wall, but Corwin could not move. He stood transfixed as the White Walkers advanced, as the Whites began to run with unnatural speed, as the cold intensified to levels that should have killed every living thing for miles. And through it all, the armored stranger did not retreat. Instead, he raised his weapon and fired. The sound defied description. It was not the twang of a bowstring or the release of a catapult, but something that seemed to tear at the fabric of reality itself, a thunderous report that shook snow from distant trees and sent ravens fleeing from their roosts miles away. The twin barrels of the weapon erupted with fire and fury, and the front rank of Whites simply ceased to exist. They did not fall or crumble. They exploded into fragments so small that even the magic animating them could not maintain cohesion. Frozen limbs and torsos burst apart in showers of ice and rotted meat, and the concussive force of the blast threw the Whites behind them backwards into their fellows. The stranger fired again, and again, and again, each shot precise and devastating, each blast removing entire swaths of the undead army from existence. He moved as he fired, sidestepping and pivoting with a combat awareness that spoke of thousands of years of practice, never letting the dead surround him, always maintaining optimal firing angles. The weapon seemed to have an inexhaustible supply of ammunition, or perhaps it fed on something else entirely, drawing power from sources that Corwin's mind could not begin to fathom. A White Walker surged forward, faster than its white servants, its ice blade raised to strike. The stranger let it close to within 10 feet before switching weapons with a speed that blurred the motion. The massive gun disappeared, replaced by a blade that emerged from his vambrace, and he met the walker's charge with a counterstrike that should have been impossible. The blade, glowing with its own internal heat, sheared through the ice weapon and continued into the walker's torso, and the ancient creature exploded in a shower of frozen fragments with a shriek that made Corwin's ears bleed. The battle that followed defied every principle of warfare that Corwin had studied. There was no shield wall, no tactical formation, no measured advance or strategic retreat. There was only the stranger, moving through the army of the dead like a scythe through wheat, killing with an efficiency that bordered on the divine. His weapons changed with bewildering speed. The double-barreled cannon that reduced clusters of whites to paste. A smaller weapon that fired with such rapidity it sounded like continuous thunder. A blade mounted on some kind of mechanized frame that tore through frozen flesh with mechanical precision. And strangest of all, his own armored fists, which struck with enough force to shatter the ancient ice that composed the walker's very being. The rangers watched from the trees, their arrows forgotten, their tactical training rendered irrelevant by the display before them. This was not a battle. This was an extermination. The dead fell in waves, their numbers meaningless against the armored figure's systematic destruction. White walkers that had survived since the age of heroes, creatures that had turned entire armies into frozen corpses, died screaming in languages older than men. Their magic, the cold that could stop a heart and freeze breath in the lungs, meant nothing to armor that had weathered the flames of hell itself. Corwin tried to count the dead but lost track after 200. The stranger never slowed, never tired, never showed any sign of the exhaustion that should have claimed him after the first minute of sustained combat. He fought with the methodical precision of someone completing a familiar task, like a farmer harvesting grain or a smith working metal, and the emotional detachment was somehow more terrifying than any rage would have been. This was not personal. This was not even vengeance. This was simply the elimination of a corruption that offended the stranger's very existence. A second White Walker fell, then a third, each death accompanied by that crystalline shriek and the explosive dissolution of their physical forms. The Whites, already operating on borrowed animation, began to collapse as the magic sustaining them faltered. Within 10 minutes of the first shot, the snow around the stranger was littered with broken bodies and shattered ice, a circle of annihilation 60 feet in diameter and growing with every passing second. Then something changed in the quality of the cold. The temperature, already far below anything natural, dropped even further, and Corwin felt his very thoughts beginning to freeze. The air itself seemed to crystallize, forming geometric patterns of frost that hung suspended and impossible. Through the trees to the north, a figure approached that made the other White Walkers seem like pale imitations. This was no mere soldier of the Winter Army, but something older, something that remembered the first sunrise and had chosen to turn its back on warmth and light. The Night King rode a dead horse through the forest, and where its hooves touched the ground, the earth itself turned to permafrost that would not thaw for 1,000 years. The stranger saw him and stopped firing. For the first time since the battle began, he went completely still, and Corwin saw him assess this new threat with the same calculating intensity he had shown upon awakening. The Night King dismounted and drew his blade, ice that had been forged in darkness before the moon first rose, and the two figures faced each other across 50 feet of frozen battlefield. They moved simultaneously. The stranger's weapon came up and fired, but the Night King raised his hand, and the blast itself froze mid-flight. The explosive force captured in a shell of ice that hung in the air for a heartbeat before shattering into harmless fragments. The ancient creature moved forward with a speed that matched the stranger's own, his blade describing patterns in the air that left trails of absolute zero in their wake. The stranger switched to his wrist-mounted blade and met the eye sword with a parry that sent up a shower of sparks that burned in colors that hurt to witness. They exchanged blows with a speed that made following individual strikes impossible. The Night King fought with technique refined over 8,000 years, every movement economical and lethal, every strike aimed at gaps in the armor that should have been fatal. The stranger countered with combat training from an entirely different reality, where wars were fought against demons and gods, where individual skill had been elevated to an art form that transcended mere martial prowess. His blade work was perfect, not in the aesthetic sense, but in the mathematical one, each angle optimized for maximum efficiency, each block flowing seamlessly into the next attack. The ground beneath them cracked and shattered, unable to withstand the forces being unleashed. Trees within 20 feet began to splinter, caught between the stranger's heat and the Night King's cold, their wood expanding and contracting until structural integrity became impossible. Corwin pressed himself against a boulder and tried to record what he was witnessing, but his fingers were too numb to hold the quill, and the ink had frozen solid in its pot. The Night King created another White Walker from thin air, pulling it into existence through sheer force of will and ancient magic. The stranger killed it without looking, firing his smaller weapon one-handed while maintaining his blade defense with the other, the shot perfectly placed to strike the walker's center of mass and reduce it to fragments. The Night King raised both hands, and the dead began to rise again, wights pulling themselves from the snow where they had fallen, bones knitting back together through magic that denied the very concept of death's finality. The stranger responded by igniting something on his back. Corwin saw flames erupt from twin exhausts mounted on the armor's shoulders, saw the stranger launch himself into the air on pillars of fire that should have been impossible, and watched as he came down on the Night King like the wrath of gods mankind had forgotten. The impact created a shockwave that leveled every tree within 30 feet and sent the rangers sprawling. The Night King caught the descending blade on his own weapon, and the collision of ancient ice and whatever hell-forged metal composed the stranger's arsenal created a flash of light that burned after-images into Corwin's vision. They separated, and the Night King's sword showed a hairline crack. The ancient creature looked at his weapon, then at the stranger, and Corwin saw something he had never expected to witness. The Night King felt fear. It was brief, quickly suppressed, but unmistakable. A moment of recognition that he faced something that could actually destroy him. The stranger advanced, his blade glowing with increasing intensity, and the Night King retreated one step, then another, his tactics shifting from aggressive assault to desperate defense. The end came quickly. The stranger feinted with his blade and fired his large weapon point-blank with the other hand. The Night King raised his ice magic in defense, but the blast was never meant for him. It struck the ground at his feet and detonated, and the explosion hurled the ancient creature backwards into a tree trunk with enough force to shatter the frozen wood. Before the Night King could recover, the stranger was on him, the wrist blade descending in an arc that caught starlight and threw it back in broken shards of illumination. The blade took the Night King's head. The ancient body erupted in a cascade of crystalline fragments, and the wave of dissolution that followed was visible even from miles away. Every White Walker within 10 leagues exploded simultaneously, their forms unable to maintain cohesion without the prime source of their creation. Every white collapsed, the dark magic animating them severed in an instant. The cold that had gripped the haunted forest for months released its hold, and the temperature began its slow climb back toward merely freezing rather than apocalyptically lethal. The stranger stood in the center of a crater of his own making, surrounded by the shattered remnants of an army that had threatened to consume the world, and he showed no signs of triumph or satisfaction. He simply turned south and began walking, his purpose not complete but merely beginning, and Corwin understood with terrible clarity that the elimination of the White Walkers had been a preliminary action, a clearing of the board before the real game began. Lord Commander Harren found his voice first. "What in seven hells is that thing?" Corwin stared at the armored figures retreating back and spoke the truth that had formed in his mind during the battle. "The end of the world as we know it, They followed him to the wall. The journey back took 3 hours, and the stranger maintained his steady pace the entire time, never stopping to rest, never showing any sign of fatigue despite the battle that should have exhausted 100 men. The rangers kept their distance, riding parallel through the trees, afraid to get too close but equally afraid to let him out of their sight. Corwin walked as near as he dared, close enough to observe, far enough to flee if those terrible weapons turned his way. The wall came into view with the first light of false dawn, and Corwin saw brothers lining the top, staring down at the approach of the armored stranger. Someone had managed to get a message ahead, because Lord Eddard Stark himself stood at the gate, flanked by his personal guard, his hand resting on Ice's pommel. The Warden of the North had arrived at Castle Black 4 days prior to investigate reports of increased White Walker activity, and now he stood face to face with something that made those concerns seem quaintly outdated. The stranger stopped 10 feet from the gate and regarded the wall with what Corwin could only interpret as professional assessment. He was evaluating it as a defensive structure, cataloging its strengths and weaknesses, and Corwin knew with terrible certainty that the stranger found it wanting. 700 feet of solid ice, magic woven into its very foundations, 8,000 years of history and sacrifice, and the armored figure looked at it the way a man might look at a particularly impressive anthill. Lord Stark stepped forward, his northern dignity wrapped around him like a second cloak. "I am Eddard Stark, Warden of the North and Hand of the King. These are the lands of the 7 kingdoms, and you stand at the border of the realm. By what right do you come here?" The stranger's helmet turned to regard Stark with those glowing eyes, and Corwin saw the warden stiffen as he felt the full weight of that attention. When the response came, it was not in words but in images transmitted directly into the minds of everyone present, and Corwin's hands shook as he tried to sketch what he was seeing. A temple burning under 3 suns, creatures of impossible geometry screaming in languages that predated light. A man in that same armor, surrounded by demons, firing weapons that tore reality itself. Worlds ending and beginning in cycles of fire and blood, a betrayal that had cost everything, a rage that had burned through eons and showed no signs of diminishing. And beneath it all, a purpose so absolute that it made mortal concerns seem like dust motes in a hurricane. The vision ended, and Lord Stark staggered, catching himself against the gate. His guards drew steel, but he waved them back, his face pale but his voice steady. "You hunt demons." The helmet dipped once, a minimalist acknowledgement. "The White Walkers are destroyed. We saw the lights in the north, felt the magic break. Whatever you did, you've saved us from the long night." Stark's voice carried the weight of genuine gratitude, but also caution. "But you continue south. Why?" The stranger raised one armored hand and pointed past Stark, past the wall, past Castle Black, toward the south where the 7 kingdoms sprawled in their endless games of power and succession. When he spoke, the words were not his own language but Westerosi common tongue, stilted and mechanical, as if the helmet's translation systems were struggling to find equivalents for concepts that had no parallel. "This world is hell." The words hung in the frozen air, and Corwin felt their truth settle into his bones. The stranger was not speaking metaphorically. He had fought in actual hell, had battled demons and dark gods in the spaces between dimensions, and he was classifying Westeros using the same taxonomy. The endless wars, the suffering inflicted by those in power on those beneath them, the slavery in Essos, the blood magic and dark rituals practiced by priests and sorcerers, the faith of the 7 promising salvation while backing kings who committed atrocities. From the stranger's perspective, it was all damnation wearing a different mask. "You cannot just march south and kill whoever you deem unworthy," Stark said, his hand tightening on ice. "We have laws, traditions. Innocent people live in those lands." The stranger's posture did not change, but Corwin felt the air pressure shift, as if reality itself was holding its breath. The helmet's eyes flared brighter, and when the mechanical voice spoke again, it carried harmonics that made the wall itself vibrate. Innocence is not measured by ignorance of evil, but by complicity in its continuation. Stark opened his mouth to respond, then closed it. What could he say? That the small folk who died in the wars between great houses were innocent? They were, but they also served those houses, swore fealty to lords who used them as pawns. That the slaves in Essos deserved freedom? Of course, but Westeros had traded with Essos for centuries, profiting from that institution. That the faith preached kindness and mercy? It did, while also supporting trial by combat and other practices that mocked those very concepts. The stranger waited 5 heartbeats for a response, and when none came, he simply walked forward. Lord Stark moved to block his path, and Corwin saw the moment when the Warden of the North realized he was looking at his own death. The stranger had not drawn a weapon, had not made any threatening gesture, but the implication was clear. Stark could step aside or be removed, and the choice was his. With visible reluctance, Stark stepped to the side. The stranger passed through the gate and into Castle Black proper. Brothers of the Night's Watch lined the walls and crowded the courtyard, all of them armed, all of them watching this invader who had destroyed the White Walkers and now spoke of their world as if it were no different from the enemy he had been fighting for eternity. Lord Commander Harren stepped forward, his face set in grim determination. "You cannot pass. I don't care what you are or what you've done. This is the Night's Watch, and we hold the realm of men. You'll not proceed without—" The stranger raised his hand and pressed his palm against the Lord Commander's chest. There was no violence in the gesture, no force, just a simple touch. But Harren's words died in his throat, and his eyes went wide as something passed between them. Corwin watched the Lord Commander's expression cycle through confusion, horror, understanding, and finally resignation. When the stranger withdrew his hand, Harren stepped aside without another word, his face the color of fresh snow. Later, when Corwin asked what he had seen, Harren could only say that the stranger had shown him the truth of the Night's Watch's purpose, how the Order had been established not to protect the realm from what lay beyond the wall, but to protect the wall itself, to ensure that the ancient bargain made 8,000 years ago remained intact. The White Walkers had been weapons, created to enforce a balance that humanity had long since forgotten. And now that weapon had been destroyed by something the original architects of that balance could never have anticipated. The stranger walked through Castle Black as if it did not exist, his attention focused on something only he could perceive. Corwin followed, still recording, still trying to understand, and saw brothers scramble out of the path of this avatar of absolute violence. They reached the courtyard where the horses were kept, and without pause or request, the stranger approached the largest destrier, a massive warhorse that had served as Lord Stark's mount. The animal should have panicked, should have kicked and bitten and fled from this thing that radiated wrongness. Instead, it stood perfectly still as the stranger placed one hand on its neck, and Corwin saw something pass between man and beast, some wordless communication that transcended normal interaction. The horse's eyes went calm, and it lowered its head in what looked disturbingly like submission. The stranger mounted in one smooth motion, his armor apparently weightless despite its obvious bulk, and the horse accepted the burden without protest. Lord Stark approached, his face troubled. "Where are you going?" The stranger looked south again, and this time Corwin followed his gaze and saw it with new eyes. King's Landing, where Robert Baratheon sat the Iron Throne and played at rulership while his kingdom rotted from within. The Riverlands, where Freys and Tullys and Blackwoods nursed ancient grudges that sent young men to die for their elders' pride. The Eyrie, where a mad woman poisoned her husband and crippled her son with overprotection. Dorne, where blood feuds stretched back generations and vengeance was considered not just acceptable but honorable. Every region, every house, every throne built on the bones of those considered lesser. "Everywhere," the stranger said, and he rode south, and Corwin followed, compelled by something deeper than duty or curiosity, sensing that he was about to witness the unmaking of an age. The first city fell without a battle. They reached Mole's Town 3 days after leaving Castle Black, and Corwin had expected the stranger to ride through without stopping. The settlement was barely worth the name, a collection of ramshackle buildings inhabited by criminals, deserters, and those who serviced the night's watch's baser needs. But the stranger reined in his horse at the town's edge and sat motionless for a long moment, his helmet turning slowly as if cataloguing every structure and every soul within. Then he dismounted and walked into the largest building, a brothel that had operated for decades in defiance of every law and moral code the realm claimed to uphold. Corwin waited outside with the growing crowd of townspeople, all of them drawn by rumors of the armored warrior who had slaughtered the White Walkers. Minutes passed, then an hour, and Corwin began to wonder if he should investigate. The stranger emerged carrying a child. She could not have been more than 10 years old, emaciated and beaten, her eyes empty of everything except the reflexive fear that came from years of abuse. The stranger held her carefully, supporting her weight as if she were made of glass, and the incongruity of such gentleness from a figure of such violence made Corwin's throat tighten. The brothel's owner followed, screaming about property and theft, and the stranger turned to face him. The man's words died unspoken. The stranger set the child down carefully and told her, in that mechanical translation of his own language, to cover her ears. She did so without question, and then the stranger drew his smaller weapon and shot the brothel owner through the head. The report echoed off the buildings, and blood sprayed across the muddy street, and the man crumpled without a sound. The stranger holstered his weapon and went back inside. He emerged moments later with 3 more children, all of them in various states of malnourishment and trauma. Then he went to the next building, and the next, and within an hour he had extracted 17 children from Mole's Town, all of them victims of the commerce in flesh that everyone knew about and no one stopped. He gathered them in the town square, and the townspeople watched in growing horror as they began to understand what was about to happen. The stranger looked at the assembled adults, his helmet's eyes burning with that terrible light, and he spoke in a voice that carried to every corner of the settlement. "You are complicit." Then he started killing. It was not indiscriminate. Corwin watched with the detached fascination of a scholar observing some natural disaster, and he saw the pattern in the stranger's actions. Those who had directly profited from the abuse of children died first, shot with precise efficiency. Then those who had enabled it, the suppliers and guards and silent partners. Then those who had known and done nothing, and this category included nearly everyone over the age of 15. The stranger moved through Mole's Town like a force of nature, his weapons firing with rhythmic precision, and within 20 minutes the only people left alive were the children and a handful of elderly individuals who had tried, however feebly, to oppose the corruption. The stranger gathered supplies from the dead, loading them onto a cart he commandeered, and he told the survivors to take the children south to Winterfell, to Lord Stark, and to tell him what had happened here. Then he mounted his horse and continued south, leaving Mole's Town burning behind him, the flames consuming the structures that had housed such systematic evil. Corwin followed, his journal filled with accounts he knew would never be believed, and he wondered how many other Mole's Towns existed in Westeros, how many other places where horror had become normalized and institutionalized. They reached Winterfell 12 days later. The journey had taken them through the northern reaches of the kingdom, and at every village and holdfast the stranger had stopped and investigated. Most settlements he passed through without incident, finding nothing that triggered whatever criteria he was using to judge the realm. But 3 times he had found evidence of the kind of evil that had infected Mole's Town, and 3 times he had administered his brutal justice. A minor lord who had been selling his own small folk to slavers from Essos, circumventing every law about bondage, died screaming as his keep burned around him. A maester who had been conducting experiments on orphans, trying to replicate the Citadel's forbidden work on human biology, was shot alongside his assistants. A septon who had been using his position to abuse those who came to him for spiritual guidance was found hanging from his own sept's rafters, his own rosary serving as noose. Word spread faster than the stranger could ride. Ravens flew south bearing warnings and pleas for help, describing an armored demon that killed without mercy and answered to no authority. The small folk began calling him the Green Death, and within days that name had evolved into something else. The Reckoner, the Judge, the Doom that walks. And everywhere he went, the same question followed. Who would stop him? Winterfell's gates were closed when they arrived. Lord Stark stood on the ramparts, his face grave, and Corwin saw the banners of a dozen northern houses flying from the castle's towers. The warden had called his bannermen, assembling an army to confront this threat that killed lords and small folk alike without discrimination. Hundreds of armed men lined the walls, and siege weapons had been positioned to target the road leading to the main gate. The stranger dismounted and approached on foot, walking with that same unhurried confidence, and Corwin saw archers draw their bows, saw spearmen ready their weapons, saw everything that northern courage and training could bring to bear focused on one armored figure. Stark's voice carried across the distance, amplified by the castle's acoustics. You've murdered noble lords and destroyed their holdings. You've terrorized the North with your vigilante justice. This cannot continue. Stand down and submit to the king's justice, or we will be forced to stop you by any means necessary. The stranger stopped 50 feet from the gate and looked up at the assembled army. Corwin held his breath, waiting for the violence he knew was coming, the slaughter that would reduce Winterfell's proud defenders to broken corpses. Instead, the stranger spoke, and his words carried a weight that made the very stones of the castle seem to listen. You invoke justice while defending those who profit from suffering. You claim righteousness while maintaining systems of exploitation. You speak of law while ignoring the crimes committed by those with titles and gold. The mechanical voice paused, and when it resumed, it carried harmonics that made Corwin's teeth ache. I have walked through actual hell and fought demons who were more honest than your nobles. The silence that followed was absolute. Stark's knuckles were white on the rampart's edge. We are not perfect, but we are not demons. We are men trying to maintain order in a world that would descend into chaos without structure and hierarchy. Your order is built on bones, the stranger said. Your hierarchy is enforced by violence against those who cannot defend themselves. Your structure exists to protect those at the top at the expense of those at the bottom. He raised his hand and pointed at the castle. How many small folk died building these walls? How many starved so that your granaries could be full? How many were hanged for stealing food while your feasts filled trenches with waste? Corwin saw the impact of those words on Stark's face. The warden was an honorable man by the standards of his culture, genuinely devoted to justice and duty, but he could not deny the fundamental truth underlying the stranger's accusations. Winterfell had been built on the labor of thousands, many of whom had died in the construction. The Stark granaries were kept full, even in lean years, a necessary precaution for a house that had to prepare for winters lasting decades. But that stockpiling had sometimes meant rationing among the small folk that bordered on starvation. And yes, people had been hanged for theft, even when that theft had been motivated by genuine hunger. What would you have us do? Stark asked, and Corwin heard the exhaustion in his voice. Abandon all structure? Let everyone take what they want? That is anarchy, and anarchy leads to suffering far worse than anything our system produces. The stranger was silent for a long moment, and Corwin sensed him considering the question seriously. weighing it against his eons of experience fighting in dimensions where order and chaos were literal forces rather than abstract concepts. I would have you acknowledge that your system is damnation wearing the mask of civilization, he said finally. I would have you stop pretending that the suffering you cause is necessary or just, and I would have you change, or I will change it for you. And if we refuse? The stranger's weapon materialized in his hand, the motion too fast to follow, and every defender on Winterfell's walls tensed. But he did not aim it at the castle. Instead, he pointed it at the sky and fired. The blast went straight up, a pillar of fire and force that punched through the clouds and kept going, visible for miles in every direction. It burned in the heavens for 5 full seconds, a column of impossible energy that made the noonday sun seem dim by comparison, and when it finally dissipated, the message was clear. The stranger could destroy Winterfell any time he chose. The walls meant nothing, the army meant nothing. All of northern military might could not stop him if he decided to reduce the castle to rubble. He lowered the weapon and holstered it. I do not wish to kill those who might yet learn, but I will not tolerate the continuation of systems designed to perpetuate suffering. He turned and walked back to his horse, mounting in one smooth motion. You have 1 year. Change, or be changed. And he rode south, leaving Winterfell unharmed but shaken, and Corwin followed, knowing that the stranger had just declared war on the very concept of feudalism itself. The twins fell on a night when the moon was dark. They had traveled the King's Road for 3 weeks, and word of the stranger's approach had preceded them like a wave of terror. Lords and ladies fled their keeps, taking their valuables and heading for the presumed safety of larger cities. Some brave or foolish souls attempted to hire sellswords to stop him, but the mercenaries took one look at the descriptions of what had happened at Molestown and decided that no amount of gold was worth facing the Green Death. The stranger had continued his pattern of investigation and judgment. Most settlements he passed through peacefully, and Corwin began to understand the criteria he was using. The stranger did not punish poverty or hardship, did not judge based on wealth or status. What he hunted was systematic evil, the kind of corruption that had become institutionalized and accepted. He was looking for the places where suffering had been transformed from tragedy into policy. The twins represented everything the stranger despised concentrated into 2 stone towers. Lord Walder Frey had ruled his bridge for 7 decades, extracting tolls from everyone who needed to cross the Green Fork, and that toll was not always measured in gold. Young women who could not pay found themselves offered a choice: service in Frey's household or find another way across. Merchants who protested the rates found their goods confiscated. Anyone who tried to bypass the bridge through the marshes discovered that Frey's men patrolled those approaches with crossbows and dogs. The stranger rode up to the eastern gatehouse and sat motionless on his horse, studying the fortification. Corwin had caught up with him an hour earlier, having fallen behind while interviewing survivors from a village the stranger had passed through. Now the maester waited, quill ready, documenting whatever would happen next. The gates were closed and barred, and men lined the walls with weapons drawn. A herald appeared on the rampart, some cousin or nephew of the ancient lord, and shouted down in a voice that tried to sound authoritative but came out thin and reedy. This is the crossing, held by House Frey by royal charter. Turn back, or face the consequences. The stranger dismounted and walked to the gate. He placed both hands against the massive wooden doors, reinforced with iron and designed to withstand battering rams and siege engines, and pushed. The gates exploded inward. They did not break or splinter. They were simply removed from existence, vaporized by forces channeled through the stranger's armor in ways that made Corwin's eyes water when he tried to observe them directly. The blast took out 10 feet of wall on either side of the gate and sent defenders flying backwards, their bodies broken by the shockwave. The stranger walked through the smoking gap and into the twins' eastern courtyard, and the real violence began. Frey soldiers rushed him with spears and swords, and they died in waves. The stranger did not use his larger weapons, did not waste ammunition on targets that could be eliminated through physical force alone. He simply moved through their ranks like water flowing around stones, and everywhere he passed, men fell with shattered bones and ruptured organs. His armor absorbed blows that should have dented steel, and his strikes carried enough force to send armored men flying into walls with lethal velocity. A knight in full plate tried to tackle him, wrapping both arms around the stranger's torso in a wrestler's grip. The stranger grabbed the knight's helmet and twisted, and the sound of the man's neck snapping was audible even over the chaos of combat. Another defender tried to shoot him with a crossbow from an upper window. The stranger drew his smaller weapon and fired without looking, the shot passing through the narrow window and eliminating the threat in under a second. The courtyard cleared in minutes, and the stranger proceeded into the keep itself, methodically clearing each room. Corwin followed at a distance, stepping over corpses and trying to maintain his scholarly detachment even as his stomach churned. This was not battle, this was extermination. The stranger was removing House Frey from existence with the same efficiency he had shown destroying the White Walkers. They found Lord Walder in his great hall, surrounded by his remaining sons and grandsons, all of them armed, all of them terrified. The ancient lord sat in his high seat, his rheumy eyes fixed on the armored figure that had just slaughtered his way through decades of accumulated power. "You'll burn in all 7 hells for this," Walder croaked, his voice still carrying the petulant entitlement that had defined his long life. The stranger approached slowly, his footsteps echoing on the stone floor, and he stopped at the base of the dais where Walder's seat was positioned. When he spoke, his words were not amplified or enhanced, just stated with the flat certainty of absolute truth. "I have been to hell. I have fought in dimensions where damnation is not a threat but a physical law. And in all my eons of war against demons and dark gods, I have never encountered corruption as casual and accepted as what you have built here." Walder opened his mouth to respond, but the stranger raised his hand and the old man's words died unspoken. "You sold your daughters and granddaughters to anyone with sufficient gold or status, caring nothing for their happiness or consent. You used your bridge as a weapon, extracting not just coin but dignity from those who had no choice but to cross. You turned every transaction into an opportunity for exploitation and then called it business." The stranger's helmet turned to regard the assembled Freys, all of them frozen in place by something more paralyzing than fear. "Your sons learned from your example. Your grandsons perpetuate your methods. You have created a legacy of systematic cruelty and taught generations that this is not just acceptable but admirable." He drew his weapon and shot Lord Walder through the chest. The ancient lord died still trying to speak, probably some final curse or threat, and his body slumped in the high seat that had supported his reign of petty tyranny. The stranger turned to the remaining Freys, and Corwin saw him make calculations, assessing each person's level of complicity and guilt. Most of them died in the next 60 seconds. The few who survived were the youngest children, those who had not yet had time to become fully shaped by their grandfather's teachings, and a handful of daughters and granddaughters who had been victims rather than perpetrators. The stranger gathered them in the courtyard, gave them supplies and gold taken from Walder's treasury, and told them to go anywhere except back to the crossing. Then he burned the twins to the ground. Corwin watched from across the river as the 2 towers became pillars of fire, the flames fed by some accelerant the stranger had deployed throughout the structure. The bridge itself, that strategic choke point that had defined the Riverland's politics for generations, collapsed into the Green Fork, its supports weakened by the intense heat. By dawn, nothing remained but smoking rubble and the foundations, and the stranger had eliminated one of the most powerful houses in Westeros without breaking stride. They continued south, and the realm began to truly panic. King's Landing received word of the twins' destruction via Raven, and King Robert Baratheon called an emergency session of his small council. Corwin learned of this later through letters sent north by colleagues at the Citadel, but the gist was clear. The Crown was preparing for war against a single man who had demonstrated the ability to destroy castles and annihilate armies. Robert wanted to ride north himself and face this threat personally, driven by the same battle hunger that had won him a throne. His advisors counseled caution, arguing that even the king should not face an enemy who had killed a White Walker in single combat and reduced House Frey to ash. Varys spoke of hiring faceless men, but even the Master of Whispers admitted that assassination seemed unlikely to work against something that had survived falling through a dimensional rift. Littlefinger suggested negotiation, offering gold and titles, but Pycelle pointed out that the stranger had demonstrated no interest in wealth or power. In the end, they decided to fortify the capital and wait, hoping that the stranger would expend his fury on the other kingdoms and leave the Crown lands untouched. It was a strategy born of desperation and cowardice in equal measure, and it would prove entirely inadequate. But before the stranger could reach King's Landing, he had other concerns to address. They crossed into the Riverlands proper, passing through villages that had been emptied by war and plague, through fields burned during the most recent conflict between Tully and Bracken, through the ruins of small folk homes destroyed because they had backed the wrong lord in some dispute whose original cause had been forgotten generations ago. The stranger rode through it all with the same grim determination, and Corwin saw him cataloguing every injustice, every preventable tragedy, every example of the powerful making the powerless suffer for crimes they did not commit. At Harrenhal, the stranger stopped for 3 full days. The cursed castle stood empty, its towers melted by dragonfire 3 centuries past, its halls haunted by the ghosts of everyone who had died within its walls. The stranger walked through every chamber, every corridor, every dungeon cell, and Corwin followed, watching as the armored figure examined the history written in stone and bone. This was where Aegon's dragons had killed thousands, burning lords and servants alike without distinction. This was where subsequent lords had ruled through fear and torture, where prisoners had been left to starve in cells forgotten by their jailers. This was where Harren the Black had demonstrated what absolute power looked like when untempered by mercy or wisdom, working slaves to death to build his monument to hubris. The stranger spent hours in the dungeons, standing in cells where people had been chained for crimes as minor as speaking against their lord or refusing to hand over their last measure of grain. He examined torture devices that had not been used in decades but had never been destroyed, kept as tools should they prove necessary again. And when he finally emerged, Corwin saw something in his posture that might have been exhaustion or might have been despair. "This is not hell," the stranger said, speaking more to himself than to Corwin. "Hell at least is honest about what it is. This world pretends its damnation is civilization." He raised his weapon and fired at Harrenhal's tallest tower. The blast took off the top 100 feet, stone and mortar vaporizing under energies designed to kill demons. The structure groaned and collapsed inward, and the stranger fired again and again, systematically reducing Harrenhal to rubble. It took 3 hours of sustained bombardment, and when he finished, the cursed castle existed only in memory and in the rubble that would stand as a monument to his judgment. "No one else will rule from these stones," he said, holstering his weapon. "Let this place return to the earth and be forgotten." They rode south toward King's Landing, and Corwin knew that the stranger had crossed a threshold. He was no longer simply hunting specific evils. He was dismantling the very structures that allowed such evil to flourish. And that meant confronting the Iron Throne itself. The city came into view on a morning thick with fog. King's Landing sprawled across its hills like a festering wound, home to 500,000 souls packed into conditions that bred disease and desperation. The stranger reined in his horse on a hilltop overlooking the capital, and Corwin saw him assess the city with that same tactical precision he had shown at the wall. The red walls, the buildings climbing over each other in defiance of any sensible planning, the bay choked with ships, the red keep rising above it all like a monument to power's tendency to isolate itself from those it claimed to serve. "How many innocents live there?" the stranger asked, his mechanical voice carrying a note that might have been reluctance. Corwin considered the question seriously. "Hundreds of thousands who have no choice in their governance, who live in squalor because they cannot afford better, who die of hunger and disease, while those in the keep feast." He paused, knowing what came next, but compelled to honesty. "But also the households of every major lord, the merchants who profit from injustice, the gold cloaks who enforce laws that protect property over people, the maesters and septons who maintain the ideological framework that justifies it all. A city built on the same principles as everything else in this world," the stranger said. "Those at the top profit from the suffering of those at the bottom, and the system is designed to ensure that relationship never changes. What will you do?" The stranger was silent for a long time, and Corwin waited, watching the fog slowly burn away under the morning sun. Finally, the armored figure spoke, and his words carried a weight that made the very air seem heavier. "I will give them a choice: change or be removed." They rode down into the city, and the panic spread before them like ripples in a pond. The gold cloaks tried to form a defensive line, hundreds of them blocking the streets with spears and shields, but the stranger simply walked his horse through their ranks, and they parted like water, too terrified to actually engage. Citizens fled into their homes and barred their doors, watching through shuttered windows as the green death rode toward the red keep. The castle gates were closed, and the walls lined with archers, crossbowmen, and whatever siege weapons could be brought to bear. Corwin counted at least 3,000 armed men visible from the courtyard alone, and he knew there were thousands more within the keep proper. King Robert stood on the walls in his armor, his warhammer in his hands, and beside him stood the Kingsguard in their white cloaks, the realm's finest warriors ready to defend their king. The stranger stopped 50 feet from the gate and looked up at the assembled power of the 7 kingdoms. When Robert spoke, his voice carried the authority of 16 years on the throne and a lifetime of believing in his own strength. "I am Robert of House Baratheon, first of his name, King of the Andals and the First Men, Lord of the 7 kingdoms and protector of the realm. You stand in my capital, having murdered my lords and destroyed their holdings. Submit to royal justice, or be destroyed by the combined might of the realm." The stranger dismounted, and the simple act of putting his feet on the ground made every defender tense. He approached the gate slowly, and Corwin saw archers draw their bows, saw crossbowmen sight along their weapons, saw every deadly instrument of war the crown could muster focused on one armored figure. "Your title is not authority," the stranger said. "It is a list of claims over people who never consented to your rule. You call yourself protector while those in Flea Bottom starve. You claim to be king while children are sold into slavery in Essos, with goods purchased with gold from your own merchants. You sit on a throne made of swords taken from the defeated and call it justice." Robert's face flushed with anger. "I am the lawful king, chosen by right of conquest, and—" "Conquest is not righteousness," the stranger interrupted. "It is merely successful violence. You killed a king and took his place, and now you pretend that act grants you some divine mandate to rule over millions who never chose you and never would if given the choice." The accusations hung in the air, and Corwin saw their impact on the defenders, because the stranger was right, and everyone knew it. Robert had won the throne by killing Rhaegar Targaryen and scattering his armies, not through any process that could be called legitimate governance. And while his rule had been relatively peaceful compared to some alternatives, it was still fundamentally based on the threat of violence against anyone who refused to submit. "What would you have me do?" Robert roared. "Abdicate? Give up the throne? Let the realm descend into chaos?" I would have you acknowledge that your rule is maintained through the same mechanisms of fear and exploitation as the systems I have been destroying. I would have you understand that the difference between you and Lord Walder Frey is merely one of scale, not fundamental morality. The stranger paused, and when he continued, his voice carried harmonics that made the Red Keep's walls vibrate. And I would have you change, or I will change it for you. Robert raised his warhammer, and the defenders braced for the king's command to attack. But before he could speak, another voice cut through the tension, high and cruel and utterly certain of its own superiority. Kill it. Queen Cersei stood on the wall beside her husband, her face twisted with contempt and fear. It is a monster that threatens the rightful order of the realm. Kill it, Robert, or prove yourself the weak fool I have always known you to be. Robert turned to his wife, and Corwin saw murder in the king's eyes, not directed at the stranger but at the woman who had just challenged his courage in front of his entire court. But before that domestic conflict could escalate, the stranger spoke again, and his words were not directed at the king but at the queen. You poisoned your husband's wine 3 times. You fathered your children on your brother and passed them off as royal heirs. You orchestrated the murder of your husband's bastards to protect your lies. You have corrupted your son with your poison until he has become a monster of your own making. The helmet's eyes burned brighter. You are evil wearing a crown. The silence that followed was absolute. Cersei's face went white, then red, then white again. Robert stared at his wife with dawning horror, seeing confirmation in her expression of truths he had suspected but never allowed himself to fully acknowledge. Jaime Lannister took a step toward his sister, his hand on his sword, but not to defend her. To silence her, perhaps, or to silence the stranger who had just revealed secrets that could tear the realm apart. Too late. The stranger raised his weapon and fired. The blast took out 50 feet of wall, vaporizing stone that had stood for 300 years, and defenders disappeared in the explosion. Cersei vanished in the blast, her body atomized before she could even scream. Robert was thrown backwards by the shockwave, his armor cracking under the impact, and the Kingsguard scattered like leaves before a hurricane. The stranger holstered his weapon and spoke into the chaos, his voice carrying to every corner of the Red Keep. I did not come here to destroy this city. I came to offer a choice. But I will not tolerate those who profit from systematic evil pretending to moral authority. He turned and walked back to his horse, mounting in one smooth motion. You have 1 year. Dismantle the systems that allow suffering to be institutional policy, or I will dismantle them for you. And if you think walls or armies will stop me, remember what just happened to your queen. Then he rode away, leaving King's Landing in chaos, and Corwin followed, wondering if anyone would have the wisdom to take the stranger's offer seriously. The North changed first. Lord Eddard Stark returned to Winterfell and called a council of his bannermen, and what emerged from that 3-week gathering would reshape northern governance forever. The changes were radical by Westerosi standards. Small folk were granted the right to petition their lords directly, without having to go through layers of bureaucracy. Taxes were restructured to fall more heavily on those with wealth, rather than those barely surviving. A new code of laws was written that emphasized rehabilitation over punishment for minor crimes, and that established clear limits on noble authority over their subjects. The other kingdoms watched with a mixture of horror and fascination. Some called Stark a traitor to his class, weakening the very foundations of feudal power. Others saw the wisdom in adapting to a new reality, recognizing that the stranger's ultimatum was not an empty threat. And a few, mostly the younger generation of lords who had grown up watching their fathers maintain order through fear, saw an opportunity to build something better than what they had inherited. But change was slow, and the stranger had given them only 1 year. Corwin returned to the Citadel, his journals filled with accounts that the other maesters received with skepticism bordering on disbelief. a warrior from another world who could kill White Walkers and destroy castles, who judged the entire feudal system as morally equivalent to hell itself. It sounded like the fantasies of a man whose mind had been broken by exposure to the terrors beyond the wall. Then the ravens started arriving from across the realm, each one confirming pieces of Corwin's story. The destruction of the twins was verified by multiple sources. Witnesses in King's Landing described the wall exploding and the queen vanishing in a pillar of fire. Northern lords wrote of seeing the stranger at Winterfell, and their descriptions matched Corwin's down to the smallest detail. The Citadel was forced to acknowledge that something unprecedented was happening, and the Archmaesters called an emergency session to discuss how they should respond. Should they support the existing order, using their knowledge and influence to help the nobility resist this threat? Should they remain neutral, observing and recording but not taking sides? Or should they embrace the changes the stranger was forcing, recognizing that the world was transforming whether they liked it or not? The debate raged for weeks, and no consensus emerged. In the end, each maester was left to make their own choice about how to respond to the stranger's ultimatum. Corwin chose to continue following the story. He left the Citadel and traveled south, tracking rumors of the stranger's movements through Essos. The armored warrior had crossed the narrow sea and was now working his way through the free cities, and the reports coming back were even more disturbing than what had happened in Westeros. In Volantis, he had freed every slave in the city in a single night, burning the slave markets and killing every master who tried to stop him. In Myr, he had destroyed a guild that specialized in training bed slaves, most of them children. In Tyrosh, he had walked through the Archon's palace and shot every official who had profited from the city's most brutal practices. The reaction was predictable and extreme. The free cities attempted to unite against this common threat, pooling their resources to hire every sellsword company in Essos. The Golden Company, the Second Sons, the Stormcrows, the Long Lances, and a dozen other mercenary groups accepted contracts to eliminate the stranger, drawn by promises of gold beyond imagination and the chance to prove themselves against a legendary opponent. They met him in the disputed lands, on a field that would later be called the Grave of Armies. 20,000 sellswords against one man should not have been a battle. It should have been an execution, a brief and brutal demonstration that numbers and skill could overcome even the most formidable individual warrior. Instead, it became a massacre that entered legend and nightmare in equal measure. The stranger did not charge the assembled armies or attempt to flee. He simply stood in the center of the field and waited, his weapons ready, as 20,000 men advanced to kill him. When they came within range, he opened fire. The reports from the few survivors were fragmentary and contradictory, colored by trauma and disbelief. They spoke of weapons that fired faster than thought, of explosions that removed entire companies from existence, of a warrior who moved through their ranks like death incarnate. Some claimed he never stopped firing for 6 straight hours, his ammunition never depleting, his weapons never jamming or failing. Others said he fought mostly with blades and fists, killing with such efficiency that gunfire would have been wasteful. What everyone agreed on was the result. By sunset, 19,000 sellswords were dead, and the disputed lands had earned a new name. The stranger walked away from the battle without visible injury, leaving behind a field so densely packed with corpses that the ground was not visible for a mile in any direction. The surviving 1,000 mercenaries fled in every direction, spreading word that the Green Death was not just a skilled warrior but something that transcended normal combat entirely. The free cities stopped trying to fight him. Instead, they began the changes he had demanded, not out of moral awakening but out of sheer survival instinct. Slavery was abolished in Volantis, then Myr, then Tyrosh and Lys and Pentos. The practice did not disappear overnight, and many former masters found creative ways to maintain their power through debt, bondage, and economic exploitation, but the formal institution that had defined Essosi society for thousands of years began to crumble. Other changes followed. Laws were rewritten to provide more protection for the vulnerable. Systems of governance that had concentrated power in the hands of a few wealthy families were reformed to allow broader participation. It was not perfect, and much of it was performative rather than genuine, but it represented a fundamental shift in how the free cities approached the question of who deserved rights and protections. The stranger continued his journey through Essos, and Corwin continued to follow at a distance, documenting everything. They traveled to Karth, where the stranger forced the 13 to open their vaults and distribute their hoarded wealth to the city's desperate poor. They went to Astapor, where the stranger destroyed every slave training facility and killed the good masters who had built fortunes on the sale of Unsullied. In Yunkai, he burned the fighting pits and shot the slavers who tried to stop him. But the most significant confrontation came in Meereen. The city's Great Pyramid rose above the Slavers' Bay like a monument to the systemic evil the stranger had been fighting since his arrival in this world. Within its walls, the Great Masters had ruled for centuries, maintaining their power through a combination of wealth, tradition, and the threat of violence. The stranger approached the pyramid alone, and the Great Masters watched from their high chambers, secure in the belief that their wealth and status would protect them. They were wrong. The stranger entered the pyramid through the main gates, walking past guards who were too terrified to try to stop him. He ascended level by level, methodically eliminating every great master he encountered. Some tried to bribe him with golden slaves. Some tried to negotiate, offering to change their ways if he would spare them. Some tried to fight, hiring mercenaries and using every weapon at their disposal. All of them died. But then the stranger found something that changed everything. In the pyramid's lowest levels, hidden behind secret doors and protected by the most loyal guards, the Great Masters had been conducting experiments that pushed beyond even their normally brutal practices. They had been trying to create new dragons, not through Targaryen blood magic, but through something darker and more desperate. The chambers were filled with children who had been subjected to alchemical treatments, their bodies warped and twisted as the Great Masters tried to force them to manifest draconic traits. The stranger found 347 children in various stages of this hideous transformation. Some were already dead, their bodies unable to survive the treatments. Some were dying, their organs failing as the alchemical compounds destroyed them from within. And some were still aware, still suffering, trapped in bodies that had become prisons of agony. Corwin arrived in time to see the stranger emerge from those chambers, carrying a child who could not have been more than 7 years old, whose skin had been covered in scales that were growing inward, tearing her apart. The stranger's armor was covered in blood, not from combat but from the mercy killings he had performed on those children who were too far gone to save. And when he set the last survivor down and turned back toward the pyramid, Corwin saw something in his posture that he had not seen before. The stranger was done showing mercy to those in power. The Great Pyramid of Meereen burned for 3 days. The stranger did not just kill the Great Masters, he erased every trace of their rule. The records of slave ownership were destroyed. The wealth they had accumulated was distributed to those they had oppressed. The very stones of their monuments were reduced to rubble, and when he finished, he gathered the surviving children from the pyramid's depths and brought them to a temple of the Red God, where priestesses with actual healing magic took them in and began the long process of undoing the damage. It was there, in that temple, that the stranger encountered another force that had been watching his campaign across Essos with growing concern. The Red Priestess Kinvara approached him as he was leaving the temple, her robes the color of flame, her eyes reflecting depths of knowledge that went beyond normal human wisdom. She bowed low, a gesture of respect that seemed genuine rather than performative, and when she spoke, her voice carried harmonics similar to the stranger's own mechanical translation. "The Lord of Light has shown me your coming," she said. "You are the warrior who fell from the sky, the judge who cleanses corruption. the force that will reshape this world, whether it wills it or not. The stranger regarded her with those glowing eyes, and Corwin sensed him assessing this new element in the equation. Your God is a system of control like all the others, worship exchanged for the promise of salvation, with the implication that those who do not submit deserve damnation. You misunderstand the Lord of Light's nature, Kinvara said, her voice calm despite the accusation. He is not a king demanding fealty, but a force maintaining balance between creation and entropy. The fire that cleanses and the warmth that sustains. The light that reveals truth and the heat that transforms. I have met beings that called themselves gods, the stranger said. They were demons wearing different masks, demanding worship to feed their power and offering nothing in return but the illusion of meaning. Kinvara smiled, and there was sadness in the expression. Then you have met false gods, not the true flame. The Lord of Light does not demand worship, he offers purpose. And he has shown me that your purpose and his align. My purpose is to eliminate systematic evil wherever I find it. Exactly, Kinvara gestured to the temple behind them where the wounded children were being tended by her sisters. You destroy corruption, you dismantle systems built on suffering. You refuse to accept that cruelty is a necessary component of civilization. These are not the actions of a demon, but of a force that serves the light, whether you acknowledge it or not. The stranger was silent for a long moment, and Corwin could almost see him processing this argument, weighing it against his eons of experience. If your God is as you describe, why does he allow his priests to burn people alive for the crime of disbelief? The question landed like a physical blow, and Kinvara's composure cracked slightly. Because we are flawed vessels attempting to interpret an infinite will, the Lord of Light gives us power and purpose, but he does not control our every action. When we burn unbelievers, we are not enacting his will, we are succumbing to our own fear and desire for control. Then your religion is no different from all the others, the stranger said. Good intentions corrupted by those who claim to speak for higher powers. No. Kinvara's voice hardened, taking on a note of command. It is different because we can change, because we can learn, because some of us recognize our failures and work to correct them. She stepped closer, and Corwin saw fire dancing in her eyes, not metaphorical but actual flames reflected in her irises. You have given the world 1 year to change or face destruction. Give the faith of the Lord of Light the same opportunity. The stranger considered this, his helmet turning slightly as if looking at something beyond normal sight. When he spoke, his voice carried a finality that suggested the conversation was ending. You have 1 year. Reform your faith, eliminate the practices that mirror the evils I have been destroying, and prove that your God is more than another system of control. Or face the same judgment I have brought to kings and slavers. He turned and walked away, leaving Kinvara standing before her temple, and Corwin saw the priestess watching him go with an expression that mixed fear and hope in equal measure. They returned to Westeros 6 months after leaving. The realm had changed in their absence, some regions embracing reform while others clung desperately to the old ways. The North had continued its transformation under Lord Stark's guidance, implementing changes that seemed radical but were proving effective at reducing suffering without causing complete social collapse. The Riverlands, traumatized by the destruction of the twins, had begun experimenting with councils that included commoners in governmental decisions. Even the Vale, traditionally the most conservative of the 7 kingdoms, was showing signs of reform. But the South remained resistant. The Reach, the Westerlands, and Dorne had all rejected the stranger's ultimatum, arguing that their systems of governance were fundamentally sound and required no adjustment. The maesters in those regions sent ravens declaring that 1 year was insufficient time to overturn traditions that stretched back thousands of years, and that attempting to do so would cause more suffering than it prevented. The stranger received these messages and said nothing, but Corwin saw him making preparations. They made camp outside King's Landing, and the stranger spent 3 days doing something Corwin had never seen him do: wait. Not because he was hesitating or reconsidering, but because he wanted to give those with wisdom one final chance to make the right choice. Ravens flew constantly between the capital and the Holdfast kingdoms. Some lords advocated for immediate surrender to the stranger's demands, recognizing that resistance was futile and reform was preferable to annihilation. Others argued for united military action, claiming that even the Green Death could be overwhelmed if the entire realm's armies mobilized against him. And some simply fled, taking their families and wealth and sailing for the Summer Isles or the Far East, hoping to escape whatever was coming. King Robert, recovered from his injuries but shaken by his wife's death and the revelations about his children, called a grand council. Every major lord in Westeros was summoned to King's Landing to discuss how the realm should respond to the stranger's ultimatum. It was the largest gathering of nobility in decades, and the tensions in the throne room could have ignited wars under normal circumstances. The stranger was not invited, but he attended anyway. He walked into the Red Keep during the council's 3rd day, passing through walls and doors as if they were not there, using some technology or magic that made physical barriers irrelevant. He appeared in the throne room while Lord Tywin Lannister was speaking about the necessity of maintaining social order, and every conversation stopped as the armored figure materialized like a ghost in green and bronze. Robert stood from the Iron Throne, his hand instinctively reaching for a warhammer that was not there. "You dare interrupt this council? I dare far more than that," the stranger said, his mechanical voice filling the vast chamber. "You have had your year. I have given you time to change, to reform, to prove that you can govern without systematic exploitation. Some of you have used that time wisely." His helmet turned toward Ned Stark, acknowledging the northern reforms. "Others have spent it denying reality and hoping I would simply disappear." Tywin Lannister stepped forward, his face carefully neutral but his eyes calculating. "You speak of exploitation as if it is unique to our society. But every civilization throughout history has been built on hierarchy. The strong rule the weak, the wise guide the foolish, the wealthy employ the poor. This is not evil, this is natural order. Natural order is a lie told by those who benefit from injustice to justify its continuation," the stranger responded. "I have seen thousands of civilizations across thousands of worlds, and the ones that thrived were those that recognized the basic dignity of all sapient life. The ones that collapsed into eternal war or demonic corruption were those that embraced hierarchy as divine mandate. You would have us abandon our entire way of life based on your experience in other worlds?" Lord Mace Tyrell interjected, his voice carrying genuine confusion. "We are not demons. We are men, trying to maintain order in a world that would descend into chaos without structure." The stranger walked forward, his footsteps echoing on the throne room's stone floor, and lords scrambled to get out of his path. He stopped before the Iron Throne and looked up at the twisted metal sculpture that symbolized ultimate authority in Westeros. This throne was forged from the swords of defeated enemies. It cuts those who sit on it, a constant reminder that power is maintained through violence. Every king who has ruled from this seat has done so by threatening death to those who would not submit. He turned to address the assembled lords. "Your entire system is built on the same principle. Obey or die, submit or starve. Accept your place or face consequences. This is not civilization. This is damnation disguised as tradition." "Then what would you have us do?" Robert shouted, his patience finally breaking. "Destroy everything. Let the realm tear itself apart. We are not perfect, but we are all that stands between this world and total chaos." The stranger regarded the king with those terrible glowing eyes, and when he spoke, his voice carried a gentleness that was somehow more disturbing than his anger. I would have you acknowledge that your imperfection causes suffering. I would have you recognize that order maintained through threat of violence is not true stability but merely delayed conflict. I would have you understand that every person born into this world deserves more than to be a tool for those with titles and gold to maintain their status. He paused, and the throne room was silent enough to hear breathing. And I would have you change, fundamentally and permanently, or I will remove you and let those you have oppressed build something better. Tywin Lannister's voice cut through the silence, cold and precise. You threaten to destroy the social order that has maintained Westeros for thousands of years. If you succeed, millions will die in the chaos that follows. Can you live with that blood on your hands? The stranger turned to face the former hand, and Corwin saw Tywin stiffen as he felt the full weight of that attention. I have lived with blood on my hands for longer than your entire civilization has existed. I have made choices that resulted in the deaths of billions because the alternative was allowing corruption to spread unchecked. I have watched worlds burn because their inhabitants chose damnation over reform. The mechanical voice grew quieter but somehow more intense. Do not mistake my willingness to give you time for weakness. I am trying to save you from yourselves, but I will not let that effort continue indefinitely. How long? Ned Stark asked, his voice cutting through the tension. How much more time will you give us? None. The word fell like an executioner's blade, and the throne room erupted in panic and shouting. Lords demanded their guards be summoned, others called for negotiation, and some simply stood frozen, understanding that they were witnessing the end of an age. The stranger raised his hand, and silence descended as if someone had physically removed all sound from the room. When he spoke again, his words carried absolute finality. Your year has ended. The kingdoms that have reformed in good faith will be allowed to continue their transformation. The kingdoms that have refused will be changed by force, and those who actively resist will be removed, permanently and without mercy. He turned and walked toward the throne room's main doors, and they swung open without being touched. But before he could leave, a voice called out, young and defiant and unafraid, "Wait!" Daenerys Targaryen stood in the doorway, flanked by Ser Jorah Mormont and 3 dragons that were still small enough to perch on her shoulders. She had arrived in Westeros only days ago, summoned by ravens from lords who hoped a Targaryen restoration might provide an alternative to both the stranger's judgment and the current system's continuation. Now she faced the green death directly, her silver hair catching the light from the high windows, and Corwin saw genuine courage in her young face. You speak of changing systems and removing those who perpetuate suffering, she said, walking forward with a confidence that belied her 16 years. But who gave you the right to judge? Who made you the arbiter of what is just and what is evil? The stranger stopped and turned to face her, and Corwin saw him assess this new element with the same intensity he had shown everything else. Right is not granted. It is taken by those willing to act when others stand paralyzed by tradition and fear. I have the right because I have the power and the will to use it in service of reducing suffering. That is the logic of tyrants, Daenerys shot back. Every conqueror claims to be bringing justice and order. Every ruler says their violence serves a higher purpose. What makes you different from Aegon the Conqueror or Robert Baratheon or any other warlord who killed thousands to impose their vision on the world? The question hung in the air, and Corwin held his breath, waiting to see how the stranger would respond. For a long moment, he said nothing, and Corwin could almost see calculations happening behind that helmet, ethical frameworks developed over eons of war being applied to this specific accusation. The difference is that I am not trying to rule, he said finally. I am not claiming a throne or demanding submission. I am eliminating systems that cause suffering and then leaving, trusting those I have freed to build something better. If they choose to recreate the same systems of exploitation, I will return and eliminate them again. But I am not offering to govern or promising a perfect world. I am simply refusing to allow certain evils to continue unchallenged. But you are deciding what counts as evil, Daenerys pressed. You are using your power to impose your moral framework on an entire world. How is that not tyranny? Because tyranny is about control and perpetuation of the tyrant's power. What I do ends when the corruption is removed. I do not seek to replace the systems I destroy with my own rule. I seek to create space for those who have been oppressed to determine their own futures. And if they choose badly, if they recreate the same systems or worse, then they will face the consequences of their choices, as all sapient beings must. But those consequences will be theirs to face, not imposed by those who claim divine right or noble birth. Daenerys's dragons stirred on her shoulders, sensing their mother's emotional state, and small wisps of smoke emerged from their nostrils. I have seen slavery in Essos. I have broken chains and freed thousands. I understand the desire to end suffering. But I have also seen what happens when conquerors impose their will without understanding the cultures they are disrupting. Good intentions are not enough. You are correct, the stranger said, and Corwin heard surprise in the mechanical voice. Good intentions alone accomplish nothing. That is why I do not offer intentions, but action. That is why I do not promise a perfect future, but insist on the elimination of specific, identifiable evils in the present. Then work with us, Daenerys said, her voice shifting from challenge to plea. Help us reform rather than destroy. Give us your knowledge and power as tools we can use to build something better, rather than wielding them as weapons that force compliance through fear. The stranger was silent for so long that Corwin began to think he would not respond. The throne room waited, hundreds of lords and ladies holding their breath, watching this confrontation between the ancient warrior and the young queen who dared to question his methods. I have tried that before, the stranger said finally, his voice carrying notes of sorrow that transcended mechanical translation. I have offered to teach and guide, to use my power in service of others' visions rather than imposing my own. And every time, without exception, those I helped eventually corrupted what we built together. Because power corrupts, and the temptation to use force to maintain order is too strong for most beings to resist. Then this time will be different, Daenerys insisted. Because I know what you know, I have seen slavery and conquest. I have watched people I freed turn around and recreate the same oppressions in new forms. I understand the temptation you describe, but I also believe that awareness of that temptation is the first step toward resisting it. The stranger's helmet turned slightly, and Corwin saw him reassessing the young woman before him. You have vision and courage, and you genuinely wish to help those who suffer. These are admirable qualities, but they are not sufficient to overcome the structural incentives that lead even good people to perpetuate evil systems. Then help me change those incentives. Help me build structures that resist corruption rather than enabling it. You have seen thousands of civilizations across thousands of worlds. Surely some of them found better solutions than what we have here. The stranger stood perfectly still, and Corwin knew that Daenerys had touched on something significant. Because the stranger had seen other worlds, other systems, and some of them must have found ways to govern that did not rely on the systematic exploitation he was fighting against. The question was whether he believed those solutions could be transplanted to Westeros, or whether each world had to find its own path through trial and error. 3 years, the stranger said abruptly. I will give you 3 years to demonstrate that reform can work. You will implement the following changes across every kingdom that swears fealty to you. Abolition of serfdom and debt bondage, establishment of representative councils with real authority, limitation of noble privilege, protection of basic rights for all citizens, and accountability for those who abuse power. He paused, and his next words carried the weight of absolute certainty. If you fail, or if you prove to be another tyrant wearing different rhetoric, I will end your reign as I have ended others. But if you succeed, I will depart and allow you to continue building whatever future you can create." Daenerys's face showed shock, hope, and determination in rapid succession. 3 years, she repeated, "and you will not interfere during that time. I will observe and evaluate. I will not intervene unless you demonstrate bad faith or gross negligence. But understand that this is not an alliance. This is a test, and the consequences of failure are absolute. I accept those terms." The stranger regarded her for another long moment, then turned to address the assembled lords. "Those who wish to support this effort may swear to her. Those who prefer the old ways may resist and face me directly. Choose now." What followed was chaos. Some lords immediately bent the knee to Daenerys, recognizing an opportunity to avoid the stranger's wrath while maintaining at least some semblance of their traditional authority. Others refused, declaring that no Targaryen would ever rule over them again, and that they would rather die than submit to either the stranger's judgment or the young queen's rule. And some simply stood paralyzed, unable to process the speed with which their world was transforming. Robert Baratheon looked at his throne, at the assembled lords, and finally at the stranger who had killed his wife and exposed the lies that had defined his reign. When he spoke, his voice was tired but carried the authority of genuine conviction. "I will not swear to a Targaryen, but I will abdicate in favor of a regency council that includes representatives from all 7 kingdoms, noble and common alike. Let those who actually understand how to govern do so, rather than a drunk whose only qualification was being good at hitting people with a hammer." The stranger's helmet dipped in what might have been approval. "That is acceptable. Reform can take many forms, as long as the fundamental principles are honored." And so the Iron Throne was dissolved, not by conquest or revolution, but by the voluntary surrender of a king who recognized that his reign had become indefensible. Robert stepped down and walked out of the throne room, and Daenerys ascended to stand before the twisted metal sculpture that had symbolized absolute power for 3 centuries. "This throne will be melted," she declared, her voice carrying to every corner of the vast chamber. "Its swords will be reforged into tools, and its metal will serve as a reminder that power built on violence is inherently unstable. In its place, we will build a council chamber where all voices can be heard, and where authority is granted through consent rather than claimed through force." The stranger watched this declaration with unreadable posture, and then he turned and walked out of the Red Keep, leaving behind a realm transformed by his presence, but not ruled by his direct authority. Corwin followed him through the streets of King's Landing, watching as the armored figure made his way toward the city gates. Citizens lined the streets, some cheering, some weeping, all of them understanding that they had witnessed the end of one age and the beginning of another. "Why did you agree to her terms?" Corwin asked, finally giving voice to the question that had been burning in his mind. "You could have simply destroyed the old order and left them to rebuild without guidance or constraints. Why give Daenerys 3 years to prove herself?" The stranger stopped and turned to face the maester, and Corwin saw something in his posture that might have been hope or might have been exhaustion. "Because I am tired of destroying," he said quietly. "Because I have fought for longer than you can comprehend, and every victory feels like failure because it requires violence to achieve. Because I want to believe that this world can choose reform over annihilation, even if my experience suggests otherwise. And if she fails? If 3 years from now the same systems of exploitation have merely been renamed rather than eliminated? Then I will return, and this time there will be no mercy, no negotiations, no second chances. I will reduce every castle to rubble, eliminate every noble house, and burn every tradition that enabled suffering to flourish." The glowing eyes dimmed slightly, "But I hope I will not have to. I genuinely hope that your species can learn from the examples I have shown, can choose to build something better than what you had before." He turned and continued toward the gates, and Corwin walked beside him, feeling the weight of history settling onto his shoulders. They left King's Landing as the sun set, painting the sky in colors of fire and blood, and Corwin knew that his work was just beginning. The stranger had given Westeros 3 years to prove itself capable of reform, and Corwin would spend every day of that time documenting what emerged from the ashes of the old order. The year that followed showed both the promise and the peril of rapid change. Daenerys proved to be a skilled administrator, tempering her idealism with pragmatism and her compassion with strategic thinking. She assembled a council that included former slaves, common merchants, minor nobles, and representatives from the faith, and together they began the difficult work of dismantling feudalism without causing complete social collapse. The first reforms were practical and immediate. Serfdom was abolished across the Crown lands, and peasants who had been tied to the land for generations were granted freedom of movement and the right to negotiate their labor. This caused immediate disruption as some lords found themselves without workers, and some peasants discovered that freedom did not automatically translate to security. But Daenerys implemented support systems, using the Crown's resources to provide transitional assistance and creating new opportunities for those displaced by the changing economy. Representative councils were established in every major city, elected through a system that balanced regional interests with popular participation. These councils had real authority over local taxation and governance, subject to oversight by the Crown but not controlled by it. The nobility objected strenuously, arguing that commoners lacked the education and breeding necessary for governance, but Daenerys pointed to the strangers' ultimatum and asked which they preferred, sharing power or losing it entirely. The stranger watched from a distance, appearing periodically in different regions to observe progress and address areas of concern. He did not interfere directly, but his presence served as a constant reminder that failure to reform in good faith would have consequences. Corwin traveled with him during these inspections, recording the stranger's assessments and the reactions of those being evaluated. In the north, the reforms had progressed further than anywhere else, with Lord Stark implementing systems that verged on genuinely democratic governance. Town meetings were held monthly where any citizen could raise concerns and propose solutions. The traditional power of the nobility had been curtailed significantly, with lords serving more as administrators and mediators than as absolute authorities. The stranger visited Winterfell and declared it an example of what he had hoped to see, and Ned Stark's exhausted relief was visible even through his northern stoicism. The Riverlands had struggled more, torn between competing factions and still traumatized by the destruction of the twins. But slow progress was being made, with former Frey holdings redistributed to communities of small folk organized into cooperative governance structures. It was messy and inefficient, but the stranger evaluated it as genuine effort rather than performance, and that judgment allowed the Riverlands to continue their experiments. The Vale proved more resistant. Lady Lysa Arryn had been removed by her own lords after it became clear that her madness endangered the entire kingdom's compliance with the stranger's demands. Her replacement, a regency council led by minor nobles and wealthy merchants, implemented minimum reforms designed to technically satisfy the stranger's criteria without actually transforming the fundamental power structures. The stranger visited the Eyrie and delivered a warning. Surface compliance would not be accepted, and the Vale had 1 year to demonstrate genuine commitment to reform or face direct intervention. The South remained the greatest concern. The Westerlands, now led by Tyrion Lannister after his father's death during a failed assassination attempt on Daenerys, showed mixed commitment to change. Tyrion understood the necessity of reform and implemented policies that reduced the worst abuses, but the entrenched power of wealthy merchant families and minor nobility limited how far he could push. The stranger's assessment was insufficient progress, but improving, a judgment that left the Westerlands' future uncertain. The Reach actively resisted, with Lord Mace Tyrell declaring that he would rather face the stranger's judgment than dismantle the systems that had made the Reach the most prosperous kingdom in Westeros. The stranger visited Highgarden 3 times, each visit escalating in severity. After the 3rd visit, when Mace continued to insist that prosperity built on exploitation was better than poverty with dignity, the stranger shot him. The execution was public and precise. Mace Tyrell died in his own throne room, surrounded by his family and bannermen, and the stranger's words echoed through the castle. Prosperity that requires others' suffering is not success but delayed damnation. You have failed your test. The Reach descended into chaos as different factions fought for control, and Daenerys was forced to intervene directly, sending troops to maintain order while a new leadership structure was established. It was messy and violent, and Corwin saw the stranger watching with an expression that might have been regret, understanding that sometimes the cost of change exceeded the cost of the evil being eliminated. Dorne proved to be the most complex situation. Prince Doran Martell had implemented reforms that technically satisfied the stranger's requirements: representative councils, limitations on noble authority, protection of basic rights. But the stranger recognized that Doran was using compliance as a strategic tool rather than embracing genuine transformation. The changes were being implemented in ways that maintained Martell power while appearing to distribute it, and the prince clearly intended to reverse the reforms as soon as the stranger's attention was elsewhere. The stranger confronted Doran in Sunspear, and their conversation lasted for 6 hours. Corwin was not present for the entire discussion, but he recorded what he could observe from the courtyard below the solar where they met. At various points, Doran's voice rose in passionate argument, and the stranger's mechanical responses carried unusual animation. They were not fighting but genuinely debating, exploring the philosophical foundations of governance and the practical realities of implementing ideals in a world that resisted them. When they finally emerged, both seemed exhausted but also oddly respectful of each other. Doran announced that Dorne would continue its reforms with greater commitment, and the stranger declared that he would monitor the kingdom's progress with particular attention. It was not complete success, but it suggested that even the stranger recognized that transformation was a process rather than an event. The faith of the Seven faced its own reckoning. The High Septon had initially tried to position the faith as a moral authority that could guide the realm through this period of change, but the stranger rejected that claim with brutal efficiency. He visited the Great Sept of Baelor and delivered a 3-hour sermon that deconstructed every theological justification for hierarchy and suffering the faith had developed over millennia. The assembled Septons and Septors listened in horror as the stranger demonstrated how their religion had been corrupted to serve power rather than truth, how their teachings about accepting one's place in life served to keep the poor compliant and the powerful secure. The High Septon tried to argue that the faith provided comfort and meaning to millions, that taking that away would cause psychological and social damage. The stranger's response was characteristically blunt. Comfortable lies are still lies. If your faith cannot survive contact with truth, then it deserves to die. Some members of the faith embraced this challenge, reforming their teachings to emphasize compassion and justice over hierarchy and submission. Others clung to tradition and faced the stranger's judgment. The Sept of Baelor was not destroyed, but it was transformed, its wealth distributed to the poor and its structure repurposed as a community center rather than a monument to religious authority. Meanwhile, the faith of the Red God underwent its own transformation. Kinvara had taken the stranger's ultimatum seriously, and she worked with other Red priestesses to eliminate the practice of burning unbelievers and to reframe their theology around service rather than domination. It was difficult work, resisted by many traditional priests who saw any modification of their practices as heresy, but Kinvara proved both persuasive and ruthless in equal measure. The stranger visited her temple in Volantis near the end of the 2nd year, and Corwin accompanied him to witness the evaluation. They found a faith that had genuinely transformed, focusing its considerable power on healing and education rather than intimidation and punishment. The stranger spent hours examining their new practices, questioning priests and priestesses about their motivations and methods, and ultimately declared the transformation acceptable. "You have proven that institutions can change if they choose to," he told Kinvara. "This does not mean I accept your theology or endorse your claims of divine authority, but it does mean I acknowledge your genuine effort to eliminate systematic cruelty from your practices." Kinvara bowed, and Corwin saw tears in her eyes. "The Lord of Light has shown me that you are both our greatest threat and our greatest hope, a force that refuses to accept easy answers and demands that we live up to our own stated values." The stranger had no response to that, but Corwin sensed something shift in his assessment of this world. Perhaps the Red Priestess was right. Perhaps the stranger represented not just destruction, but the possibility of genuine transformation. As the third year approached its end, Corwin compiled his observations into a comprehensive report. The reforms had taken root in most of the Seven Kingdoms, though their depth and sincerity varied significantly. The North had embraced change most fully, becoming a model for what was possible when leaders genuinely committed to transformation. The Riverlands and Crownlands showed steady progress, with new systems of governance proving both more just and more effective than what they had replaced. The Stormlands and Iron Islands had been slower to change but were moving in the right direction. The South remained problematic. The Reach was still recovering from the chaos following Mace Tyrell's execution, and while reforms were being implemented, they were inconsistent and often reversed when local resistance proved too strong. The Westerlands under Tyrion showed genuine effort but limited results, constrained by economic realities and entrenched interests that the Lannisters' considerable wit could not fully overcome. Dorne continued its strategic compliance, implementing reforms that satisfied the letter of the stranger's demands while subverting their spirit. Most significantly, Daenerys had proven to be exactly what she had claimed, a reformer who understood both the necessity of change and the dangers of imposing it too rapidly. Her governance was not perfect, and she had made mistakes that cost lives and opportunities. But she had also demonstrated consistent commitment to reducing suffering and increasing justice, and she had done so while building coalitional support rather than relying on force alone. The stranger returned to King's Landing on the third anniversary of his arrival in Westeros. The city had transformed during his absence, and Corwin marveled at the changes. The Iron Throne had indeed been melted, and in its place stood a circular council chamber where representatives from across the realm met to debate and decide policy. The worst slums of Flea Bottom had been cleared and rebuilt, not as luxury housing but as dignified accommodations with proper sanitation and access to food and healthcare. The City Watch had been reformed from a corrupt enforcement tool into a genuine peacekeeping force accountable to civilian oversight. Daenerys met the stranger in the council chamber, flanked by her advisors and representatives from each kingdom. She looked older than her 19 years, worn down by the responsibilities of leadership but also strengthened by them. Her dragons had grown significantly, now large enough to ride, and they perched on the chamber's walls like living gargoyles. 3 years have passed, Daenerys said, her voice steady despite the tension in the room. We have implemented the reforms you demanded. We have dismantled systems of exploitation and built new structures designed to prevent their return. We have stumbled and made mistakes, but we have continued moving forward. She paused, and Corwin saw genuine uncertainty in her expression. I ask for your judgment, not because I seek your approval, but because I need to know if what we have built is sufficient or if we must go further. The stranger walked through the chamber, examining the council's setup, reading documents, describing new laws and policies, questioning representatives about their experiences and observations. He spent hours on this evaluation, treating it with the same seriousness he had shown every other judgment he had rendered. Finally, He returned to where Daenerys waited and delivered his assessment. "You have achieved more than I expected, but less than I hoped. The North has proven that genuine reform is possible, and the systems Lord Stark has implemented should serve as models for other kingdoms. The Riverlands and Crownlands have shown consistent progress, and while their transformations are incomplete, the trajectory is positive." He turned to regard the representatives from the southern kingdoms. The Reach, Westerlands, and Dawn remain problematic. The Reach has made minimal progress and continues to resist fundamental change. The Westerlands show good faith effort but insufficient results. And Dawn has implemented reforms that satisfy technical requirements while subverting their intent. Doran Martell's representative shifted uncomfortably but said nothing. The stranger's attention returned to Daenerys. "You, personally, have exceeded my expectations. You have balanced idealism with pragmatism, compassion with justice, and vision with practicality. Under your leadership, this realm has transformed in ways I did not believe possible when I first arrived." Relief flooded Daenerys' face, but the stranger raised his hand before she could speak. "However, that transformation is fragile and incomplete. The systems you have built are better than what existed before, but they remain vulnerable to corruption and regression. The representatives you have empowered could easily become a new aristocracy if their authority is not carefully constrained. The councils you have established could transform into new tools of exploitation if their oversight mechanisms fail." "What would you have me do?" Daenerys asked. "Continue. Refine. Resist the temptation to believe that you have solved problems that are inherently ongoing. Governance is not a destination but a process, and the moment you stop actively working to prevent corruption is the moment it begins to reassert itself." The stranger walked to the chamber's center and addressed everyone present. "I will depart this world as I departed the dimension from which I came. But I will be watching, and I will return if I see the same patterns of systematic exploitation beginning to emerge. You have proven that change is possible. Now prove that it can be sustained." He turned and walked toward the chamber's exit, but Daenerys called after him. "Wait. I need to know. After everything you have seen, everything you have done, do you believe we can succeed? Do you believe humanity is capable of building systems that resist corruption and serve justice rather than power?" The stranger stopped and turned, and Corwin saw him consider the question with the full weight of his eternal experience. When he spoke, his mechanical voice carried notes of something that might have been hope. "I believe that you are capable of trying, and that the effort itself has value, even if ultimate success proves elusive. I believe that some individuals can resist the corrupting influence of power, though systemic incentives make such resistance difficult. And I believe that awareness of these dangers is the first step toward mitigating them, even if full elimination proves impossible." "That is not a ringing endorsement," Daenerys said, a small smile appearing despite the seriousness of the conversation. "No," the stranger agreed, "but it is more optimism than I have felt in millennia, and for that you have my genuine respect." And then he left, walking out of the council chamber and through King's Landing's streets, and Corwin followed for the last time. They traveled north, retracing the path the stranger had taken 3 years earlier, and Corwin saw the changes that had spread across the realm. Villages that had been impoverished now showed signs of modest prosperity. Small folk who had once moved with the hunched posture of the perpetually oppressed now walked with dignity. Children who would have been illiterate were learning to read and write in schools funded by redistributed noble wealth. It was not paradise. Problems remained, and new challenges had emerged from the reforms themselves. But it was better, measurably and undeniably better. And Corwin understood that the stranger had achieved something rare, meaningful change that did not rely on his continued presence to maintain. They reached the wall as winter began its slow retreat, and the stranger stood before the ancient barrier one final time. Castle Black had changed as well, transforming from a military outpost into a research station studying the magic that had created the White Walkers and exploring ways to ensure such weapons could never be created again. Lord Commander Harren, older and warier but still serving, approached the stranger with visible trepidation. "You are leaving," he said. "Not a question." "Yes." "Will you return?" "If necessary." Harren nodded, accepting that answer, and extended his hand. The stranger regarded the offered gesture for a moment, then reached out and clasped the Lord Commander's forearm in the warrior's grip. It was a small moment, a brief acknowledgement between two beings who had both dedicated their lives to holding back darkness, and Corwin felt tears prickling his eyes as he recorded it. The stranger released Harren's arm and turned to Corwin. "You have documented everything faithfully, never distorting the truth to serve a preferred narrative. This is the highest service a scholar can provide." Corwin bowed, unable to speak past the lump in his throat. The stranger walked north, beyond the wall, into the haunted forest where he had first arrived. Corwin did not follow, understanding that some endings were meant to be witnessed from a distance. He stood on the wall beside Lord Harren and other brothers, watching as the armored figure disappeared into the trees. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then the sky tore open once more, the same wound in reality that had heralded the stranger's arrival now forming to facilitate his departure. Light that hurt to witness poured through the rift, and Corwin saw geometric patterns in the opening that suggested dimensions his mind could not properly process. The stranger walked toward that impossible door, and just before he stepped through, he turned and looked back at the wall one final time. Corwin could not see his face behind the helmet, but he felt the weight of that final gaze, felt the assessment and the hope and the warning all combined into one last moment of contact between this avatar of divine violence and the world he had transformed. Then the stranger stepped through the rift, and it sealed behind him, and he was gone. The silence that followed was profound. Corwin stood on the wall for hours, staring at the forest where the stranger had disappeared, trying to process everything he had witnessed over the past 3 years. Finally, as the sun set and the stars began to emerge, he descended to Castle Black and returned to his chambers to complete his chronicle. He wrote through the night, recording the stranger's departure and his final words, trying to capture not just the facts but the feeling of having witnessed something that transcended normal historical events. This was not just the story of one warrior's campaign against corruption, but a testament to the possibility of genuine transformation, proof that even systems that seemed eternal and unchangeable could be reformed when confronted by sufficient will and moral clarity. As dawn broke, Corwin set down his quill and read through the final pages of his manuscript. It was incomplete, he knew. The story would continue for decades, perhaps centuries, as Westeros grappled with the changes the stranger had forced upon it. Some regions would succeed in building just and sustainable systems, others would fail and recreate the same exploitations in new forms, and perhaps, someday, the stranger would return to judge what they had made of the opportunity he had given them. But that was a story for other chroniclers to tell. Corwin's task was finished. He gathered his journals and sent them to the Citadel, where they would be copied and distributed throughout the realm. Some maesters would dismiss them as fantasy or propaganda. Others would recognize them as the most important historical documents produced in generations. And a few, perhaps, would understand them as they were meant to be understood, as a warning and a promise, a reminder that no system of governance is permanent, and that justice delayed is not justice denied, but merely justice building toward inevitable expression. Corwin lived another 20 years, long enough to see Daenerys's reforms take deep root in most of the 7 kingdoms. Long enough to watch the next generation grow up in a world that valued dignity over hierarchy. He never saw the stranger again, but he felt his presence in every choice the realm's leaders made, in every moment when someone with power chose compassion over cruelty, reform over reaction. On his deathbed, surrounded by younger maesters who had read his chronicles and dedicated their lives to continuing the work of documentation and truth-telling, Corwin spoke his final words. The stranger showed us that damnation is not a supernatural punishment, but a choice made by civilizations that prioritize power over justice. And he showed us that redemption is possible, if we have the courage to change and the wisdom to maintain those changes against the constant pressure to regress. Remember that, record it, teach it, and pray that we never need him to return and remind us again. And then Maester Corwin closed his eyes and passed into the quiet darkness, his work complete, his chronicle preserved, his life a testament to the power of bearing witness to transformation.